Number 3, Creepy True, Craigslist Horror Stories, Volume 1. Story 1, The House Sitter. My name is Morgan. I was 25 years old, a freelance writer living in Chattanooga, Tennessee, working from home and perpetually looking for ways to supplement an income that fluctuated in the specific and exhausting way that freelance income always does. The Craigslist listing said, house sitter needed 2 weeks mid-October pet care for 1 cat, $300 plus free lodging, no parties responsible, adult only. The poster said her name was Helen and that she was traveling to care for her elderly mother in another state and needed someone reliable to stay in her home and look after her cat. $300 and a free 2 weeks of not paying my own rent was the kind of math that does not require much deliberation. I messaged Helen on a Sunday evening, spoke with her by phone on Monday, and moved into her house in the North Shore neighborhood of Chattanooga on the following Friday at noon. Comment below right now and tell me if you have ever stayed somewhere alone and started noticing things about the space that the person who lived there had never mentioned. Because Helen had lived in that house for 11 years, and there were things about it she had either forgotten to tell me or had decided I did not need to know. Stay with me. I want to describe Helen before I describe the house, because Helen is important to understanding everything that followed. She was around 55, soft-spoken, meticulous in the way of someone who's lived alone for a long time and has organized their world according to a system that makes complete sense to them and requires explanation for anyone else. She walked me through the house for 45 minutes. The cat's name was Oliver. He ate twice a day. He had a sensitive stomach and could only have the specific brand of food stored in the cabinet to the left of the stove. The mail went in a basket by the front door. The back door required you to lift the handle slightly before turning the key, or it would not lock. The thermostat was not to go below 68 because the pipes in the crawl space were old. She covered everything with the care of someone who had thought about it in advance and written herself notes. The one thing she did not cover was the basement. The house was a craftsman bungalow, 1920s construction, 2 stories, plus the basement, which in a house this age meant a low-ceilinged concrete space accessible through a door in the kitchen that Helen had shown me in passing during the tour. She'd opened the door, gestured vaguely into the darkness below, and said there was a spare freezer down there with some extra food if I needed it, and the circuit breaker panel was on the east wall if anything tripped. She had closed the door again before I could see much of anything, and we had moved on to the discussion of the thermostat. I settled into the house that Friday afternoon with my laptop and my work bag and Oliver, who was an orange tabby with the specific self-possession of a cat who has decided to tolerate your presence provisionally. The house was comfortable, well furnished without being precious about it. Books everywhere, good light through the front windows in the afternoon, the kind of lived-in quality that makes a space feel welcoming to a stranger. I set up my workspace at the dining room table and worked until about 9 p.m. and went to bed. The first 3 days were quiet and easy. I worked, I fed Oliver, I took short walks in the neighborhood in the evenings. The house was exactly what Helen had described. Nothing unusual, nothing uncomfortable, the particular piece of having a whole house to yourself temporarily. On the 4th day, I needed something from the basement freezer. I had run low on groceries, and Helen had specifically mentioned there was food down there, so the trip was practical and expected. I opened the kitchen door, found the light switch on the right side of the stairwell, and went down. The basement was larger than I had expected. The freezer was against the far wall as Helen had described, and the circuit panel was on the east wall, as she had said. Between those 2 points, the space was open concrete, with a few storage shelves along one wall, holding the ordinary accumulation of a long residence. Paint cans, a holiday wreath in a plastic bin, cardboard boxes labeled in permanent marker with words like tax records and winter clothes. I opened the freezer and found it well stocked with the labeled containers Helen had mentioned. I took out 2 and turned to go back upstairs, and that was when I saw the other door. It was in the wall, under the staircase, partially obscured by one of the storage shelving units that had been positioned in front of it, though not fully. The shelving unit covered the left third of the door. The door itself was wooden, older than the rest of the basement construction, with a latch handle rather than a round knob and a padlock, through a hasp on the right side, where the padlock was engaged. I stood and looked at it for a moment. Old houses have storage spaces under stairs, sub-basement crawl spaces, coal rooms from before central heating root cellars. A locked door in the basement of a house built in the 1920s was not inherently alarming. I noted it and went upstairs. But I thought about it for the rest of that day. Helen had mentioned everything else in the house. Every cabinet, every quirk of every appliance, every preference Oliver had about the placement of his water bowl. She'd been exhaustive and specific, and she had said absolutely nothing about a second door in the basement. That evening, I texted Helen and said the house was great and Oliver was doing well, and asked if there was anything I should know about the basement storage area. I kept it casual. She replied within a few minutes and said, "Oh, that old room has been locked for years. It was a root cellar originally, nothing in there anymore. Do not worry about it." Do not worry about it. I turned that sentence over for a few hours before I fell asleep, and it sat wrong in a way I could not fully name. Not the locked room itself, which as I said was explainable in an old house. What sat wrong was the phrasing. Not the room is empty or there is nothing interesting in there. Nothing in there anymore. The word anymore. A word that implies a before. I went back to the basement the following afternoon with my phone flashlight and moved the shelving unit far enough to see the full door. The door was solid, and the padlock was a quality lock, the kind that would require bolt cutters rather than anything improvised. But at the bottom of the door, in the gap between the wood and the concrete floor, there was a draft, a slight but distinct movement of cooler air from whatever was on the other side, which meant the space beyond the door was not a sealed room, but something with airflow, something that connected to outside in some way. I went back upstairs and called my friend Marcus, who I trusted to think clearly about things, without either dismissing them or amplifying them unnecessarily. I described the door and the anymore and the draft. Marcus was quiet for a moment and then said that either everything was fine or it was not, and that the only way to move from uncertainty to certainty was information. He asked if I could reach Helen by phone rather than text. I called Helen. She answered on the third ring. I said I hoped I was not bothering her and that I was just curious about the root cellar room, that I had noticed the draft from under the door and wondered if it connected to the crawl space under the house and whether that was anything to be aware of for temperature control. I kept the whole question grounded in practical concern. Helen was quiet for a moment that lasted just slightly longer than a practical question about crawl space ventilation would require. Then she said, yes, it connected to the exterior foundation vent on the north side of the house, and that in the fall it could get a draft, and I should just put a towel along the bottom of the basement door to keep the cold from coming up into the kitchen. Then she said, I really do not go down to the basement much myself. A woman who had lived in a house for 11 years, who knew the specific temperature below which old pipes would have problems, who knew which brand of cat food to use and how to slightly lift the back door handle before locking it, who did not go down to the basement much herself. I moved the conversation on, and we said goodbye, and I sat at the dining room table with Oliver on the chair across from me and thought about what I wanted to do. What I did was call the Chattanooga Police non-emergency line. I gave them Helen's address and explained the situation precisely. I told them I was the house sitter, that I had found a locked room in the basement with a draft indicating an exterior connection, and that the homeowner's responses to my questions had been specific and thorough about everything in the house, except this one feature which she had described as something she avoided herself. I told them I was not certain anything was wrong, and that I was calling out of caution rather than certainty. The dispatcher was professional and said they could send an officer for a welfare check. 2 officers came the following morning when the light was good. I let them in and showed them the basement door. They examined the padlock and the door and the draft and made a call. A 3rd officer arrived with a bolt cutter. The root cellar behind the door was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, brick-lined cold with the exterior vent I had detected on the north wall. It was not empty. Along the right wall were 2 metal shelving units containing glass jars, dozens of them sealed with wax and unlabeled. On the floor beneath the shelves were 4 wooden crates that had been there long enough to have traces of moisture damage along the bottom edges. The jars contained organic material that was sent for forensic analysis. The investigation that followed is part of the Hamilton County, Tennessee public record. I was not given the full details of the analysis results, and I have chosen not to seek them out independently because the partial information I was given was sufficient and more than I was fully prepared to absorb. What I know is that Helen had not been back to the basement much herself, for reasons that the investigation clarified to the satisfaction of the relevant authorities. I was out of the house by that afternoon. I stayed with Marcus for the remaining 10 days of what was supposed to be the house-sitting period. Helen was contacted by investigators. I was not kept informed of the full outcome of those conversations. Oliver was taken in by a neighbor who had known Helen for several years and who seemed like a genuinely good person in the specific way that made me feel better about Oliver's situation than about almost anything else connected to that October. I have never done a house-sitting gig through Craigslist since that Friday. I do not think I will. There are houses that keep their secrets in locked rooms in basements, and there are people who post Craigslist listings for house sitters and know exactly what they are not mentioning during the tour. The 45-minute walkthrough was real and detailed and comprehensive. She just left one door out of it and called it nothing anymore and hoped I would not think about the word anymore the way I ended up thinking about it. Pay attention to the things people leave out. Sometimes what is not said is the entire thing. Story 2, the used laptop. My name is Travis. I was 30 years old, a middle school science teacher in Columbus, Ohio, whose personal laptop had died in the middle of a semester in the worst possible way, suddenly and completely, taking 2 months of lesson materials with it. Because I had not been backing things up the way I told my students to back things up. I needed a replacement immediately, and my budget was limited to whatever I could find used and functional for under $300. The Craigslist listing said MacBook Pro, mid-tier specs, $250, good condition, minor cosmetic scratching on lid, fully functional, comes with charger. The seller said his name was Bryce and that he was upgrading to a newer model and just wanted the old one gone. I messaged him on a Tuesday. We agreed to meet at a Panera Bread on Sawmill Road on Wednesday at 4 p.m. I brought cash and a list of things I wanted to check, before buying. He brought the laptop in a padded sleeve, and we sat at a corner table and I spent 20 minutes going through the machine. It ran fine. I paid him and took it home. And that evening after dinner, I opened it up to start migrating my work files, and I found the folder that Bryce had not deleted. Hit subscribe right now if this is your first time here, and tell me in the comments if you have ever found something on a used device that you were not supposed to see, because what was in that folder changed the next 72 hours of my life and put a man in a situation he created entirely for himself. I want to be clear that I did my due diligence at the table in Panera. I checked the battery health, the keyboard, the trackpad, the ports, the screen for dead pixels, and I ran a quick system check to confirm the specs matched what Bryce had advertised. Everything was clean. The cosmetic scratch in the lid was exactly as described. Bryce was around my age, normal in appearance. Polite, a little distracted in the way of someone who had somewhere else to be. I had no concerns walking out with the machine. I got home, made dinner, and sat down at my kitchen table around 7:30 p.m. to start setting up the laptop for my own use. I always start by doing a factory reset on a used machine because I do not want the previous owner's files and preferences cluttering the system. But before resetting, I do a quick look through the existing file structure to make sure there's nothing that needs to be flagged for the seller, a document they might have missed, a folder of personal photos they would want back. I have bought used electronics 4 or 5 times over the years, and twice I have found something the seller clearly wanted and returned it without incident. It is just a courtesy. I opened Bryce's user folder and scanned the directory. Documents, downloads, pictures, the standard organization. Most of it appeared to have been cleared already. The documents folder was empty. The downloads folder had a few old installer files, nothing of personal value. The pictures folder had a thumbnail view of what appeared to be about 40 images, which I opened at the folder level without clicking into any individual file. 40 thumbnails. The thumbnails showed images and what appeared to be screenshots of text conversations. I looked at the thumbnails more carefully. The text conversation screenshots were exchanges between two people. One side of the conversations was in a different color, from the other the standard visual format of a text message thread. The screenshots had been taken systematically one after another, covering what appeared to be a long period of time based on the date stamps visible in the thumbnail resolution. I clicked on one of the text screenshots and enlarged it. The conversation was between two people, one of whom I assumed was Bryce, based on the context, and one of whom was identified in the thread by a first name only. The content of the conversation was an escalating pattern of messages that began as apparently ordinary communication and progressed into something that I recognized immediately from mandatory reporter training as grooming behavior. The specific language, the specific escalation pattern, the specific way boundaries were tested and normalized in incremental steps. I had sat through 3 hours of professional development on exactly this pattern 2 years earlier as part of my teaching certification requirements. The other person in the conversation was not an adult. I closed the laptop. I sat at my kitchen table for approximately 2 minutes without moving. Then I opened it again and went through the rest of the images in the folder. There were more screenshots. The pattern was consistent and documented across dozens of exchanges. The folder also contained images that I will not describe here, but that were consistent with and documented further what the text screenshots had established. I called Columbus police at 7:58 p.m. I told the dispatcher I'd purchased a used laptop that afternoon, and had found files on it that I believed constituted evidence of a crime involving a minor. I gave the dispatcher my address and Bryce's first name and told her I still had the Craigslist listing on my phone with his contact number. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. I showed them the folder without touching anything on the machine beyond what I'd already opened. One of the officers called for a detective. The detective arrived 40 minutes later, and I walked her through exactly what I had found and in what order I had found it. I gave her the laptop, the charger, and my phone, with the Craigslist listing and my message thread with Bryce. I gave a formal statement that evening that took about 90 minutes. Bryce was identified through the phone number associated with the listing and was taken into custody the following afternoon. The forensic examination of the laptop was completed over the subsequent weeks and produced findings consistent with and beyond what I had initially observed in the folder he had failed to delete. The detective who handled the case called me twice over the following month with procedural updates. On the second call, she told me the investigation had identified the individual in the conversations and that the case had expanded in scope beyond what the initial laptop content had suggested. I was reimbursed the $250 through the restitution process connected to the case. It took about 8 months. I did not spend it for a long time after I received it. It sat in my account for several weeks while I thought about what to do with it, and eventually I donated it to a child advocacy organization in Columbus, whose work I had become familiar with through the case process. The replacement laptop I eventually bought came from a certified refurbisher with a documented wipe and reset process. Every used electronic device I have purchased since that Wednesday evening has been factory reset before I do anything else with it. And I have never again done a courtesy check of a previous owner's files because I understand now that the courtesy cuts in both directions and I am not equipped to absorb every version of what that check might reveal. Bryce had listed the laptop on Craigslist because he was upgrading to a newer device. He had cleared the documents folder and the downloads folder and had not cleared the pictures folder. Whether that was carelessness or something else is not something I can answer. What I know is that the folder was there and I opened it and I made the call at 7:58 p.m. and that call is a decision I think about most clearly and most steadily from that entire period. It was not a hard decision in the moment. I want to say that clearly. No, it was not a hard decision at all. It was the only decision. The hard part came later and took longer and is not entirely finished yet. Check what is on a used device before you reset it. Not because you're looking for something, because sometimes something is there and you are the person who is going to find it. And what you do next is going to matter in ways you cannot fully anticipate from the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening. Story 3, The Night Audit. My name is Jesse. I was 23 years old, working 2 jobs in Knoxville, Tennessee, trying to save enough to finish my associate degree without taking on more student loan debt than I already had. The Craigslist listing said night audit clerk, needed independent motel 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., $12 an hour, must be reliable and comfortable working alone, no experience required, will train. The poster listed the motel's name and an address on Chapman Highway on the south side of Knoxville. I'd driven past the motel before. Small, independently owned, the kind of place that has been there since the highway was the main route through and has stayed there through every change the surrounding area has gone through. I called the number in the listing on a Thursday morning and spoke with the owner, a man named Gerald, who said he needed someone to start the following Monday. I said I could do that, and he told me to come in Sunday evening at 10 for an hour of training with the outgoing clerk. Stay with me and drop a comment telling me what city you are coming from tonight. Because Gerald's motel was a real job, and Gerald was a real employer. And what made that night shift the scariest experience of my working life had nothing to do with Gerald or the motel itself. It had everything to do with the man in room 11 and what I found in the parking lot at 4:30 in the morning. The Sunday evening training was brief and practical. The outgoing night clerk was a woman named Sheila, who had worked the shift for 2 years and was leaving for a full-time position at a hospital. She walked me through the front desk system, which was a simple software program that handled check-ins and check-outs, room status, and billing. She showed me where the cash drawer was, how to run the end-of-night audit report, and how to use the radio to reach Gerald if anything required a management decision. She showed me the monitor bank connected to the exterior security cameras, 4 of them covering the parking lot and both entrances. She told me the shift was quiet most nights and that the primary job was keeping the audit report accurate and being available if a guest had a problem. She said one thing before she left that I remembered clearly and thought about often in the weeks that followed. She said if a guest made her uncomfortable, she always kept the front desk counter between herself and them, and she always kept the radio on the counter where she could reach it with one motion. She said she had only needed to use the radio twice in 2 years, but that knowing it was there had made the difference on both of those occasions. I said I understood, and she handed me the keys and left. The first 2 weeks of the shift were exactly as Sheila had described. Quiet, methodical, a rhythm of small tasks spread across 8 hours. The motel had 22 rooms and averaged about 12 occupied on a weeknight. Mostly long-haul drivers, a few traveling workers, occasional families passing through on the highway. Normal guest population for that kind of property on that kind of road. The man in room 11 checked in on my 15th shift. He came to the desk at 1:20 a.m., which was not unusual since people arrived at all hours on a highway property. He was around 50, traveling alone, paid in cash, which was permitted and not uncommon. He asked for a room away from the highway side, and I gave him 11, which faced the interior courtyard rather than the road. He took the key card and went to his room without further conversation. The first unusual thing happened at 2:45 a.m. The room 11 camera, which was the courtyard-facing camera that covered the block of rooms from 8 through 14, showed the man from 11 standing outside his room door. Not going anywhere, not smoking, not on his phone, just standing outside his door, facing the parking lot for approximately 12 minutes. Then he went back inside. I noted it and kept working. People do odd things in motels at odd hours. There's a quality of dislocation to motel life that produces behavior you would not see in a person's normal environment. At 4:15 a.m., the exterior entrance camera on the south side of the parking lot showed a car I had not seen before pulling in slowly without its headlights on. It parked in the far corner of the lot away from the occupied rooms, which put it partially out of the camera's optimal angle. The engine went off. No one got out. I looked at the camera monitor for a full minute. The car did not move. No interior light came on to indicate anyone exiting. It just sat in the far corner of a motel parking lot at 4:15 in the morning without its headlights. I looked at the room 11 camera. The door to room 11 was open, not wide open. The same 8 inches or so that a person opens a door when they are looking out from inside, and the man was not visible in the gap. Just the darkness of the interior room and the slightly narrower darkness of the gap. I picked up the radio and called Gerald. He answered on the third call, groggy but present, and I described both things in sequence. The parked car without headlights, the open door of room 11, He said he was coming in and told me to lock the front desk access door and stay where I was. I locked the access door and watched the monitors. At 4:22, the door to room 11 opened fully and the man stepped out. He walked across the courtyard toward the parking lot. He did not look at the front desk window. He walked with purpose to the far corner of the lot and the car that had parked there. He got into the passenger side. I could not see clearly from the monitor angle what happened inside the car. The car sat in the corner of the lot for approximately 4 minutes. Then it drove out the south entrance the same way it had come, in still without headlights, moving slowly until it reached Chapman Highway, where the headlights came on and it turned north and was gone. The man from room 11 walked back across the parking lot and went back into his room and closed the door. Gerald arrived at 4:40. I showed him the camera footage on the monitor playback. He watched it twice without speaking. Then he called Knoxville police. 2 units came within 15 minutes. Officers knocked on the door of room 11, and the man answered. He was cooperative. He consented to a search of the room. What the officers found in the room, I was not given full details about, but the search took 40 minutes and produced enough for the man to be taken into custody. The car that had come and gone without headlights was identified through a partial plate capture from the south entrance camera. It was found parked 2 miles away on a residential street later that morning. The investigation that followed involved the Knoxville Police Department and a second agency whose name I was given, but am choosing not to include here because it indicates a scope of involvement that I think speaks for itself without elaboration. I worked 2 more shifts at the motel before Gerald and I mutually agreed that the position was probably not the right fit for the current period, given what had happened. He paid me out for the full week and thanked me for calling him. He said Sheila had never needed to call him at 4 in the morning in 2 years, and that he thought I had done the right thing. The radio was on the counter where I could reach it in one motion. Sheila had told me that on Sunday evening, and it had been the most useful piece of professional guidance I have ever received from anyone leaving a job. I finished my associate degree the following spring. I work days now. I have worked days for the past 2 years, and I do not miss the highway at 4 in the morning, the particular quality of lights in a motel parking lot before dawn, or the monitor bank with 4 cameras showing 4 different angles of a space where you are the only person watching. The man in room 11 had known where the cameras were positioned. He had timed the car's arrival for the window between my routine audit checks, which Sheila had told me to run, on the hour. He had calculated the blind spot in the parking lot that the south camera could not fully cover. He had been in that motel before, or one exactly like it, and he knew how the night audit shift worked. The one thing he had not calculated was whether the clerk that night would be the kind of person who kept the radio on the counter where they could reach it in one motion. I was that kind of person because Sheila had told me to be. Pay attention when someone who has done a job longer than you tells you how they stayed safe doing it. They are not being dramatic. They are giving you the specific and earned knowledge of every moment they needed what they are describing, and were glad to have it. The radio was 6 inches from my right hand at 4:15 in the morning, and that distance was the entire margin between what happened and what might have happened if I'd been someone who left it on the shelf across the room. 6 inches, that is the whole story.